Hi everyone, I'm visiting today at the Wardrobe by Me YouTube channel to share with you my Summer Tulip Top. My name's Karina and you will find me at my own YouTube channel called Lifting Pins and Needles. The Summer Tulip Top has been on my radar for quite a while. I had wanted to make one and I'm very glad I got the chance. It's got a lot of cute details and I love that it's made for woven fabrics. It's quite easy to sew. It doesn't have many pattern pieces. The front is cut on the fold and you will see a high neckline with gathers. There you will have a banded collar that overlaps at the back with a little buttonhole and button, and at the back you have a center seam with a little slit on the top. You don't need to set in sleeves here. There are drop shoulders. The cuff that is sewn on the edge of the drop shoulder is cut on the bias, which makes it conform really well to the shape of the drop shoulder. I really enjoyed that. And the fit is semi-fitted at the bust and hips. It's not a boxy top at all. It's not oversized. It's not fitted. I think it's just right. Depending on how tall you are, the length of the Summer Tulip will hit the full hip and you have a curved hem. You need woven fabrics. The ones that I think will look the best are the lightweight wovens. So you could try some more structured ones like cotton gauze, and then maybe some flowy ones like crepe, maybe a light tencel, rayon linen blend would be nice, maybe even some chiffon and silk. And the pattern also says that you can use a low stretch knit that doesn't have elastane, so you don't want a knit that is super stretchy. In my case, those are really hard to find, but I know they're out there. The types of knits that don't stretch much I think would work well. I think in the past I've seen some ITY that doesn't stretch much at all. So you could make it out of that type of fabric, having the same type of precautions of interfacing certain areas. One of the fabrics I chose is a crepe chiffon, but it is not as light as other crepe chiffons I've worked with in the past. It is sheer, only slightly, and it wasn't that hard to work with. The sizes in this pattern are from 0 to 24. As for the feet, you will have some positive ease, of course, around 4 inches at the bust and about 5 to 5.5 inches at the hips. And in the sewing segment of this video, you're going to see how to sew the Summer Tulip Top with special emphasis on the collar, on those gathers, on the cuffs. It is not a hard piece to sew, and if you are a confident beginner, you will be perfectly fine making these for yourself for summer. Such a cute top. Let's see how it's sewn. This is the cuff pattern piece and it's the only piece that needs to be cut on the bias. You can see the grain line mark there is on the bias. So the way I can fit it on my little piece of fabric is just flipping it this way. So I've transferred my arrow to the wrong side of this pattern and I'm just going to align this here, making sure that this arrow is on the grain line. My pattern piece, of course, is slanted at a 45-degree angle, and that's how I'm going to cut it. These are the two main pieces. The front is cut on the fold and the back isn't. The back has a center seam, and on the top you can see it goes out a little bit, and that's the extra seam allowance there for the little slit at the center back. There is the curve of the neckline on the back. And the curve on the front looks wider and sort of shallower because it will be gathered in. You'll find a little notch right there and on the other side, and that's where the gathers will happen. The hem is curved. You can see it's not a straight hem. You have a drop shoulder with a curve under the arm, no sleeve to set in. These are the two cuff pieces that will go on the edge there of the sleeves and the two collar pieces. One is not interfaced, one is interfaced. You can see that's the interfaced one, and I blocked fused that one, meaning I fused a larger area on the fabric first and then I cut out my collar piece when the fabric had already the interfacing on. Here we have the back piece. This is the neckline on the top and the shoulder coming over here, and this is the center seam. Over here you can see that it goes straight and then it comes out a little bit, and that's to have extra seam allowance on the top for the slit. Just align those edges, and then from the curve out there I serged these edges separately so that that could be ready before actually sewing. There is a mark on the pattern that you can see in yellow there, and that is where I'm going to start sewing. Right there, it'll be wider at this section, but it is 3/8 seam allowance from this part right there. So start there, and it's a straight seam all the way down like that. Then we can press the seam open. So I'm starting right at my reference mark there and reinforce. Okay, I've sewn that, and now when we press this open, we're gonna have a larger seam allowance here on the top, as you can see. On the top part where it's wider, we're gonna fold it in once by 3/8 of an inch, and that will take us to the edge of the bottom seam allowance, like that. And then when we press this one, that means that on the top it'll be folded twice. On the top, you will have extra seam allowance. It'll be double the seam allowance of this section right here. On the top, I have actually 3/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then you can see it go narrow to 3/8 on the straight seam. So once that's pressed, we can just take this raw edge and press it in again, and then we'll have 3/8 of an inch seam allowance throughout. Only that at the top, it'll be in a double fold, and that will give that section more structure and will allow us to top stitch nicer. So I'm just folding that raw edge inside and giving it a press. I'm gonna go and tidy this up and then give it a nice top stitch right there, and that will hold all that finished. I also want to stay stitch the neckline. I should have actually done that before doing the seam. Here is my slit on the top of the center back. I have done some quick hand basting to hold that down to prevent my fabric from shifting. The two collar pieces here, right sides together. One is interfaced, one isn't. I want my interfaced collar to be on the outer side of the garment so that it's nice and smooth. It's also going to take away the sheenness of the fabric. You can see how transparent this is. So on the collar that's going to go on the outside, what I've done is a guide stitch at 3/8 of an inch. Maybe you can see it there. And that helps me go to the iron and press 3/8 of an inch seam allowance up very accurately, very neatly, without having... I did this guide stitch with a long stitch length. I can just pull this thread and remove it. So I'm just pulling the thread out and it's gone. So aligning these collar pieces together along the top curve, this is where we need to sew them together at 3/8 of an inch. On the bottom curve, you'll find a few notches. You can see those yellow marks there, so that's going to help you not get confused. We are going to sew along the top edge that doesn't have any notches. I'm going to trim this seam allowance just a little bit, leave it at about 1/4 of an inch, and then I'll do a few snips. It is curved here on the top slightly. I'm going to extend these two pieces. On my right hand, I have my interfaced collar, the one that will go on the outside, and on my left, I have the non-interfaced one that will go inside, and that is the sheer one. I want to do a little understitching here because I don't want my inner collar to be seen on the outside. So just leaving the seam allowance extended as it is so that it's behind the sheer collar, I'm going to go ahead and understitch, sew on the edge. When I understitch, I don't sew from the underside of the garment. I just don't like that because I can't really see what I'm doing, and it is a seam that's seen, so I'd rather do it from this side. It's just basically edge stitching right there. I've got a blind hem foot with a needle to the left, and that helps me understitch very neatly. And I'm going to understitch a little further from the edge so it doesn't interfere with other stages of the collar when this is closed. So I won't understitch from the total edge. I also stopped before reaching the end right there. So when this collar is pressed nice and neatly, you will see that the understitching will keep the inner collar inside and it won't be seen from the outside. I'll go ahead and give this a nice press, making sure I don't get rid of this first pressing I did, but just to neaten this up, and then I'll be ready to sew it onto the neckline. This is the top of the front neckline. As you can see, it's nice and extended because it has ease for it to be gathered into there. You can see a notch right there. That is the center notch, and that is the notch on the other edge. On the collar, you will have 3 notches too. These are the outer notches, and the one in the center. You can see how smaller this is and how larger that is for it to be gathered. So we want to be able to see these notches when we gather, because that is how we're going to match it up later onto the collar. So I'll do a gathering stitch from that outer notch to that other outer notch, 1 row at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then the next one I'm going to do it at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance from the edge. so that I have quite a nice gap to do my gathers, and my gathers will end up being between the 3/8 seam allowance that I'm going to use to sew the neckline to the collar right there. I've lengthened my stitch length to 5. Having those 2 rows of gathering stitches done, I can just leave it for now because we need to finish the shoulder seams before we put on the collar. At this point, I'll bring the back and put it on top of the front piece, right sides together, and I'll be sewing both shoulder seams and serging them, pressing the seam towards the back. Before sewing the collar onto the neckline, I want to show you one thing. When you extend this, you will find those notches at the bottom. You'll see a center notch and then 2 on each side. This notch right there is not the center of the collar piece. So if you fold this, you'll find that it's not the center, and it's supposed to be like that. I'm holding that middle notch there, and you can see that on one side the collar is longer than on the other. It's supposed to be like that for the overlap to happen on the top where you have a button. So don't think it's a mistake, it is supposed to be like that. What I'll be sewing onto the neckline is this side that's not interfaced. We are looking at the neckline right now. The shoulder seams have been sewn, serged, and pressed towards the back. This is a little slit on the back. And this is our collar piece. I have the gathering stitch there, and I can see that middle notch right there on the neckline, the one on the outer edge and the one on this outer edge that are going to match this. Now when we start pinning this on, and when we get to the back, on one of them we will have 3/8 of an inch protruding from that slit, so you have a little bit left over, and on the other side you have 1 1/8 inch protruding, so one will protrude more than the other. I'm going to pin this to the neckline. Remember, we are working with the neckline wrong sides up. We are sewing the collar from the wrong side of the blouse, and then when this gets flipped over, we will have this on the front. So let's find that middle notch and match it up to the neckline right there. And then this little notch right here will match this one there. You can see all the excess that needs to be gathered into this short little area there. It's going to look super pretty. Here onwards, partial front neckline here, and the rest of the back, there's no gathering happening, so everything should match 1 to 1. On this side you have that 3/8 of an inch protruding. So I'll put a pin right there, and then keep pinning the rest. I would rather pin everything and leave the gathering for the very end. I think it'll be less fiddly that way. Okay, so when you're working with the blouse wrong sides up, you have the collar piece on top. The collar is right side to wrong side of blouse. On your left hand, you will have the side that protrudes 3/8 of an inch. Over here, on this other side, it will protrude more. Okay, so on this side that is on my right hand, when you pin from the outer notch of the neckline out, that's 1 to 1, you will have 1 1/8 protruding on the end. So having these sections of the collar pins, now we can fiddle with the gathering bit. I have 2 rows, and I'm going to be gathering into the center. I'm going to take 2 of these threads and pull until all of that excess is the same length as this, but gathered. Okay, that looks right. And then on the other side, I'm going to do the same. Okay, and here we can see all that gathered area. I'm going to flip this way and just neaten these up. I'm actually going to flip my pins to the other side. I should have pinned from this side actually. Okay, this is what I would need to sew from the edge right there along the top of the collar. This fabric wants to slide and slip everywhere, so I'm going to give it a quick hand baste and get rid of all those pins, and it will just make sewing easier. I have some hand basting that's going to help, and I'm going to sew with the gathered side on top so I can control this area and see how that's looking. I wouldn't want to sew with the gathers on the bottom because who knows what the feed dogs will do to them down there. I really want to see what's happening. It ends up being that I'll start sewing from the edge that has the largest area protruding along the top towards the other side, and it's with a 3/8 seam allowance. the gathered area, you can see my 2 rows of gathering stitches and that my seam is going to be right in the center of them. That means that I can control and have really nice gathers. It's such a really helpful technique. Now I can whip out this basting stitch. It comes out very easily. I'm also going to remove the bottom row of the gathering stitch because you would be able to see that, and that also comes flying out. I'm going to remove all the gathering stitches, why not? Okay, let's turn our blouse to the right side. This is the right side of the blouse. Here is the seam with the gathers, and now we can bring this outer collar, that is the interfaced one, that already has that fold, and we can bring it and match it here, covering that seam line right there. And we can do that all along the edge. But before doing all that, we're going to finish these short ends. This is the one that protrudes the most, and we're just going to bring it and put it right sides together. Make sure that raw edge is also folded up to match the other one like that. And now I'm going to sew that at 3/8 of an inch. That's why I didn't want the understitching to go all the way over there. I didn't want that to get in the way. I wanted all this section to be free. And the same with this other side. Just bring it together there. Make sure both edges are folded up like this. And on this side, basically that 3/8 will be right on the edge, right there. I'm going to trim the seam allowance down a little bit. Now we can turn these corners right sides out, and I like to fold the seam allowances onto themselves right there on the top. Hold it and then flip it. And you always get a really nice crisp corner without needing to trim into seam allowances or anything like that. Same as on this other side. Now I can have my collar coming towards the right side, meeting that seam like that. I'm going to hand baste this all the way across, covering the gathered area right there. And then we'll just finish top stitching this down and the collar will be finished. You have the slits meeting together and this side will come over that side. And then that's where we're going to have our little button. This is the side with the longest bit of the collar protruding. I have hand basted all of this down, covering the seam. We are working on the outside of the blouse, and I love this because when we top stitch we can actually see what we're doing and where it's going to be visible. This is the gathered area of the center front. So nice. So now I'll just sew on the edge. I've swapped my presser foot again to my blind hem foot and moved the needle to the left. You could do this with a regular presser foot, but then you would have to rely on going a bit slow and really concentrating to get a straight seam. Whereas here, the ridge of the presser foot just guides you along the edge of the seam and it gives you a really straight top stitching and it gives you really straight stop. And the result is really neat top stitching without much effort at all. I didn't backstitch at the beginning or the end because I don't want bulk right there. So I'll take the thread to the back and secure it here where it's going to be invisible. I've given this a nice press. It's looking very nice. Now here on this area that overlaps is where you would do your buttonhole, or maybe you could put on a snap. I'm just going to do a buttonhole there later. Our side seams are still loose and haven't been sewn, so we just do side seams, the hem.
And then on the edge of these sleeves,
we sew our little cuffs. This is one of the cuff pieces. You just fold it right sides together, align the short ends, and sew them together at 3/8 seam allowance. As I'm manipulating these cuffs, I'm just going to be extra careful with them because they are cut on the bias. So I will just be careful to not stretch them out. After sewing the side seams, pressing the seam to the back, I have the edge of the sleeve right there. And now I can attach the cuff, but from the wrong side of the blouse. The seam of the cuff will meet the seam of the sleeve underneath. We'll put the cuff over the sleeve so that the sleeve is inside. The pattern piece is slightly smaller than the sleeve circumference, but because it's cut on the bias, it would mold perfectly to the circumference here when we pin it on. After sewing the cuff, I serge the edges. And now when you open this, the seam will be on the right side of the blouse. I want the cuff to stay out and the inside of the blouse not come out, so I'm going to do a row of understitching right here, keeping the seam allowance extended like that. I will be sewing on top of the wrong side of the blouse and the seam allowance under there on the edge. So you can see my side seam, and I'm sewing from the wrong side. Okay, after sewing that seam, I have understitched it. The seam is actually on the right side of the blouse here, and the cuff will come folded over like this. And on the inside it's going to be so neat, and you have that understitch there holding the inside of the blouse on the inside so it won't be seen. This is the right side of the blouse, and this is the cuff extended. The seam is right in there, and then you fold the cuff out, and because it's cut on the bias, it molds perfectly to the shape here of the curve of the sleeve. It's not straight here, it does have a nice curve. Because my fabric is really sloppy, I'm going to do a little hand tack under there just to keep it in place. And also here on the top where the shoulder seam is, so I'll put a few pins here, and I'll just do a little invisible sewing from the inside, and that's it. It looks really beautiful. I'm sharing some images here of my summer tulip top. Now this one was made without any pattern modifications. I chose my size based on my body measurement and blended between two sizes. I find the length a little long for what I prefer. For my next version, I know I would shorten it by 2 inches. Other than that, the fit is perfect. I have enough room around my neck to feel comfortable. Although it is a high neckline with that collar, it's not constrictive. It does not actually touch my skin, and it's a really cute top. I really love those gathers there. I think this is a top that you would really enjoy sewing for summer. As part of this collaboration, I also have a video about the summer tulip top on my own channel, Lifting Pins and Needles. This pattern is awesome for making little changes if that makes you happy, and it's part of the fun you have in sewing. It's always great to sew the original, but it's also fun to experiment with different finishes. I hope the sewing content is helpful for you, and it will make sewing your summer tulip top easier, and it will complement what you already have in the pattern instructions. Bye, and happy sewing.